When you picture a modern state visit, it's incredibly easy to get distracted by the front-end user interface.
Oh, absolutely. The optics are everything.
Right. You see the immaculately planned state dinners,
Yeah.
the diplomatic smiles, the exchange of historical artifacts. I mean, it looks flawless.
It's designed to look flawless, yeah.
Exactly. But if you dig into the stack of analysis you sent us today regarding King Charles III's April 2026 address to the U.S. Congress, you quickly realize something else.
The back end is a mess.
Yeah. The back-end source code of this geopolitical relationship is throwing off massive system errors. So we are bypassing the pageantry today.
Which is necessary, I think.
For sure. Our mission in this deep dive is to figure out how one beautifully delivered vague phrase in diplomatic speech accidentally opened up a 150-year-old Pandora's box of shared state-sanctioned violence.
Right. And to understand the weight of that structural critique, we really have to look at the immense pressure cooking right underneath this specific visit.
Yeah, set the scene for us.
So it's April 28th, 2026. This is Charles's 20th visit to the United States overall, but it's his very first as reigning king. And, the timing couldn't be more volatile.
Right, because, the surface-level details you provided in the sources are incredibly charming.
They really play up the charm offensive.
They do, like the White House state dinner features Dover sole and spring-herbed ravioli. And the dessert is literally shaped like the White House beehive.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Made with actual honey harvested from the grounds. Which is, a clear nod to the king's environmentalism.
It's highly personalized.
Yeah.
And the gifts were, too.
Exactly. Charles hands the president a framed 1879 design plan for the Resolute desk.
Right.
Which was carved from British ship timbers.
Right.
And then the president hands back a 1785 letter from John Adams recounting his first meeting with King George III. Charles even gets up in front of Congress and makes a joke.
The hostage joke, right?
Yeah. He jokes about the ancient British tradition of taking a member of Parliament hostage at Buckingham Palace whenever the monarch speaks at Westminster.
It is peak diplomatic theater.
Totally. Okay, let's unpack this because I'm trying to square all of that warmth, all that theater, with the geopolitical reality happening literally outside the Capitol doors.
Yeah, it's like a theatrical production where the set backstage is entirely engulfed in flames.
Right. Because the U.S. and the U.K. were in the middle of a brutal public feud.
The relationship was arguably at its lowest point in decades. Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the Trump administration were locked in a standoff on, multiple fronts.
It wasn't just one issue.
No, not at all. The UK had outright refused to back a US-led military offensive against Iran.
Which did not go over well.
To put it mildly, that prompted the US president to publicly call Starmer a, quote, profound failure to the alliance. He even specifically stated Starmer was no Winston Churchill.
Ouch. And the friction wasn't just military, right? It was economic, too.
Exactly. The US was threatening these severe, sweeping tariffs on British digital services, basically trying to force the UK to abandon its own tech taxes.
But the detail in your documents that really struck me, the one that seemed the most intense, was the leaked Pentagon intelligence.
Oh, the Falkland Islands reassessment.
Yes. U.S. documents leaked suggesting the administration was actively reassessing British sovereignty over the Falklands.
Which is massive.
That is the ultimate third rail in British foreign policy. You are touching the absolute raw nerve of the 1982 conflict with Argentina.
Right. So, knowing all that, it tells us exactly why Buckingham Palace deployed the monarchy at this precise moment.
To put out the fire.
Essentially, yeah. The British state needed to use the crown to project an image of historical stability that sits, way above the partisan mudslinging.
Because Charles is constitutionally required to remain nonpartisan.
Exactly. But if you look at the mechanics of his 30-minute speech, he weaves in these highly specific tactical warnings.
Yeah, I noticed that. He explicitly urges lawmakers to ignore, and I'm quoting his exact words here, clarion calls to become ever more inward-looking.
It's a very polite, very royal reprimand.
And he doesn't just leave it as a philosophical point either. He reminds Congress that NATO invoked Article 5, its Mutual Defense Clause, for the very first time in its history right after September 11th.
Right, when British forces came to the aid of the U.S.
Yeah, he even physically visited the 9/11 Memorial in New York on this trip just to visually hammer home the point. Like, British forces bled to help the United States. Solidarity has to go both ways.
It is the ultimate exercise in soft power. He leverages shared grief to subtly critique modern isolationist policy, but he never crosses the line into overtly dictating legislation.
Right. He also uses this geological metaphor that I really want to unpack because it perfectly transitions into the darker half of your
The
documents.
mountain range metaphor.
Yeah. Charles mentions that millennia ago, before any human borders were drawn, the mountains of Scotland and the American Appalachians were actually a single, continuous mountain range.
Forged when ancient continental plates collided.
Exactly. It's a gorgeous image for the U.S.-UK alliance.
It really is.
But it also implies that the bedrock of both nations is inextricably entangled deep underground. And according to the impact report you shared with us, that entangled bedrock isn't just about a shared love of liberty.
No, the report argues it's about a shared blueprint for administrative cruelty.
Right. So let's look at the exact legal phrasing in the most heavily scrutinized line of his entire address.
This is where things take a turn.
Charles praises the vibrant, free societies of both countries. And he states that this freedom provides the collective strength to, quote, support victims of some of the ills that, so tragically, exist in both our societies today.
Social ills.
Social ills. And the media reaction to that phrase was instantaneous. I mean, everyone assumed they knew exactly what he was signaling.
It jumped right to the scandals.
Yeah, the immediate interpretation was that this was a highly calculated diplomatic apology regarding his brother, Prince Andrew, and the Jeffrey Epstein scandal.
Because the pressure leading up to the speech was just immense.
It was. Lawmakers like Ro Khanna, Summer Lee, and Pramila Jayapal actually hosted roundtable on Capitol Hill with Epstein survivors right before Charles spoke.
I remember that. They brought in siblings of Virginia Roberts Giuffre.
Right. So the media consensus framed the phrase social ills as a woolly illusion, like a way for the crown to acknowledge the elephant in the room and placate critics without formally admitting fault.
Or exposing the institution to legal liability.
Exactly. But, and this is a really important pivot for us to make, just to be clear to you listening, what's striking about the impact report you provided is how strictly it evaluates this from a structural level. It completely ignores the partisan media noise.
We're just looking at what the analysis argues about state policies here.
Right. We're not endorsing a viewpoint, just tracing the argument in the source material. And the analysis argues that by using the phrase social ills, Charles inadvertently pulled the thread on a centuries-long legacy.
What's fascinating here is that for advocacy groups representing adoptees and victims of institutional child abuse, these aren't isolated scandals.
Or just the actions of a few bad actors.
Exactly. The report says they represent a highly organized, state-sanctioned mechanism of violence, specifically forced family separation.
And the blueprint for this begins with a staggering piece of imperial history, the British Home Children.
Right, which is a program that ran from 1869 all the way into the 1970s.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah.
1970s. And the data shows between 130,000 and 150,000 children were shipped from the UK out to Commonwealth nations.
Primarily to Canada and Australia.
I always thought, based on, the official narrative, that these were rescue missions. Like the state was supposedly clearing out disease-ridden slums and saving orphans from starving to death on the streets of London.
A lot of people think that, but the demographic breakdown completely shatters that myth.
Only about 12% of those shipped overseas were actual orphans.
12%. That's it.
So what about the rest?
The other 88% were victims of a bureaucratic trap. We have to look at the mechanism of how these separations occurred. You had working-class parents facing temporary economic devastation, so maybe a severe winter, an injury, or an illness. To survive, they would temporarily place their children into the care of local charities or workhouses.
Fully intending to return for them once they were back on their feet.
Exactly. But when they came back a few months later, the children were just gone.
Gone.
Yeah. The local authorities utilized a legal framework that allowed them to act in loco parentis. They literally signed the children over to colonial authorities and deported them across the ocean.
Without notifying the parents or seeking any kind of consent.
None at all. It was an assembly line for cheap imperial labor.
And when these children arrived in Canada or Australia, they didn't find loving adoptive homes.
Not at all. They were placed as indentured agricultural laborers or domestic servants.
And the local populations actively stigmatized them as gutter children.
Gutter children, yeah. We now have extensive public inquiries detailing the horrific systemic abuse inside institutions like the Fairbridge Farm Schools.
Where children were subjected to physical and sexual abuse and forced to do hard labor barefoot in stone quarries. Just awful stuff.
It is.
And a royal family's connection to this isn't just some abstract historical association, Reddy. It's deeply financial.
Oh, absolutely. The monarchy historically patronized these exact charities.
Princess Elizabeth, before she became Queen Elizabeth II, made a 2,000-pound donation to the Fairbridge Society in 1948.
She funded it out of her own wedding gifts.
Right, it was championed as this vital investment in the empire. And if we fast forward to 2011, King Charles's own charity, the Prince's Trust, officially absorbed the Fairbridge Society.
Meaning they inherited the historical legal liability of that abuse.
Yeah, to the point where the Prince's Trust ultimately had to establish a compensation fund for the survivors.
Which perfectly illustrates the inescapable continuity of the crown. The monarch is a living institution permanently tethered to the administrative actions of the past.
Okay, but I do have to push back here for a second. Because looking at the timeline of state responses in the documents, hasn't this issue technically been settled?
In what sense?
Well, Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued a formal apology in 2009. British Prime Minister Gordon Brown formally apologized on behalf of the state in 2010. He called it a shameful episode.
That's true, the apologies did happen.
And the UK government literally established an ex gratia payment scheme in 2019, paying out £20,000 per survivor.
So in the realm of statecraft, isn't that the definition of closing the ledger on a social ill?
Well, not if you view family separation not as a past mistake, but as an active operating system.
An operating system.
Yeah, the report argues that you cannot just issue a payout and close the book, because that exact same administrative mechanism was simply transferred and adapted by other nations.
Okay.
If the British home children were the blueprint for exporting youth to build an empire externally, the United States and Canada took that blueprint and used it for internal colonization.
You're talking about the indigenous boarding school systems. Yes. The mechanism was identical, severing the parent-child bond under the guise of state-mandated welfare.
But the objective shifted.
Exactly. Under the ethos of manifest destiny, the goal was deliberate cultural erasure and territorial expansion. By breaking the generational ties of indigenous families, the state could more easily absorb their lands.
And the mechanics of how this was executed are just brutal. I'm looking at the findings from Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland's investigation here in the U.S.
The numbers are devastating.
They documented at least 18,000 Native children forcibly removed from their parents and placed into a network of over 500 schools.
Right.
The investigation identified nearly 1,000 deaths and 74 associated gravesites.
And much like the home children, we are currently in the apology phase of the timeline for this, too.
Right. Pope Francis apologized on Canadian soil in 2022. President Biden issued a formal apology in 2024.
But the report highlights how the downstream trauma is still actively warping the system today.
Because there is a massive, disproportionate representation of indigenous children currently trapped inside modern foster care and adoption systems.
Exactly. The system didn't break, it just evolved.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Ah.
Because if you're listening to this and wondering how a British charity in 1948 logically connects to a U.S. border policy in 2018, the link is the weaponization of the family unit.
Right. The analysis connects the historical bedrock directly to the modern political crisis happening during Charles's visit.
The report draws a direct, unbroken line from these historical boarding schools to the zero-tolerance immigration policy implemented under the exact same U.S. president hosting King Charles for this 2026 state dinner.
The bureaucratic machinery is exactly the same, but the state dropped the pretense.
What do you mean?
Well, historically, family separation was masked under the false guise of philanthropy or education, right? Saving children from poverty or civilizing them.
Right, quotes around civilizing.
Exactly. But with zero tolerance, the architects explicitly acknowledged that the parent-child bond was being targeted as a punitive deterrent against migration.
Yeah, former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly bluntly referred to it as a tough deterrent.
He explicitly said that the separated children would be, quote, put into foster care or whatever.
And the bureaucratic chaos that followed wasn't an accident. The report says it was a feature of the policy.
Yeah, let's break down how that mechanism worked.
An adult crossing the border was immediately charged criminally and handed over to the Department of Justice.
Right, and because the parent was in criminal custody, the child was reclassified as an unaccompanied minor.
And then handed over to the Department of Health and Human Services.
Exactly. The two massive federal databases did not share tracking numbers.
Which is just, I mean, that is how parents were routinely deported back to Central America while their toddlers were scattered in facilities across the United States. It made reunification practically impossible.
Physicians for Human Rights eventually classified the psychological devastation of these forcible separations as torture under international law.
And that brings us to the most glaring, uncomfortable paradox in King Charles's entire address to Congress.
The religious aspect?
Wait, I'm really trying to square this. During the speech, Charles leans heavily into religion. He speaks beautifully about the Christian faith, serving as a firm anchor that guides society toward peace, mutual understanding, and the triumph of light over darkness.
Right.
But your documents point out that the architects of the zero-tolerance policy utilize those exact same religious texts.
They did. Former Attorney General Jeff Sessions explicitly cited the Apostle Paul in Romans 13.
Which is the biblical command to obey the laws of the government.
Yes, he used it to provide theological justification for tearing migrant families apart. So how does a society reconcile that legally or morally?
The impact report argues that you can't reconcile it because the state's foundational documents are built on these exact contradictions.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, during his speech, King Charles lavished praise on the Magna Carta.
He reminded Congress that in 1789 alone, the Magna Carta was cited in at least 160 U.S. Supreme Court cases.
He framed it as the ultimate bedrock for the rule of law and human liberty.
But the critical analysis counters that by pointing out these exact same legal frameworks also codified property rights that were systematically applied to human beings.
Family separation wasn't a virus that infected the software of the state. It was hard-coded into the operating system from the very beginning.
It is a highly effective mechanism of control, which perfectly explains the glaring contradiction in how the state treats children legally brought into the country under its own oversight.
You're talking about the transnational adoptees.
Yes, let's look at the citizenship loophole, because the bureaucracy here is failing in real time. In 2000, Congress passed the Child Citizenship Act, which was supposed to automatically grant U.S. citizenship to foreign-born children legally adopted by American citizens.
But there was a catastrophic mechanical failure in the drafting of the law.
It wasn't fully retroactive.
Right. The automatic upgrade to citizenship only applied to adoptees who were under the age of 18 on a highly specific date.
February 27, 2001.
Exactly. Meaning thousands of adult adoptees, people who were legally brought to the U.S. in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, whose adoptions were fully approved by U.S. courts, suddenly aged out of the protection.
Through absolutely no fault of their own, they were left without basic citizenship rights.
And the real-world consequences of that bureaucratic oversight are devastating.
Yeah, you have people in their 40s and 50s who have lived in America their entire lives. They pay taxes, they have American spouses, American children.
But because of a paperwork discrepancy from decades ago, a routine traffic stop can flag them in an ICE database.
They are stripped of their ability to legally work, denied housing, and thrown into detention centers.
And they face deportation to birth countries like South Korea or Colombia, where they have zero familial ties.
They don't speak the language and essentially face exile. They are being banished by the very country that brokered their adoption in the first place.
And the gridlock in Washington over this is maddening.
Yeah, while King Charles stood at the podium preaching against the dangers of being inward-looking, the very lawmakers giving him standing ovations are the ones maintaining a legislative chokehold on the Protect Adoptees and American Families Act.
A bill which would simply close this loophole and grant these people their legal rights.
The juxtaposition is intentional in the report's analysis, isn't it?
Highly intentional. It highlights how the descendants of the British home children, the survivors of indigenous boarding schools, the deported parents of zero tolerance, and stateless adult adoptees are all fighting the exact same administrative machine.
For them, these aren't just abstract social ills to be gently lamented in a speech.
No, they are deliberate, ongoing acts of administrative violence.
So what does this all mean? We started with this image of a diplomatic theater production.
Pageantry.
Right. On the surface, King Charles delivered a masterclass in soft power. He navigated a burning geopolitical minefield between the U.S. and the U.K. flawlessly, projecting unity and shared values.
But the rigorous analysis you provided proves that when a head of state champions the collective strength of free societies to combat social ills, they inadvertently shine a massive spotlight on the exact populations those societies have marginalized to maintain their power.
King Charles himself quoted President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address during his speech, noting that the world may little note what we say, but will never forget what we do.
And for you listening, this is why this matters. The actual measure of a nation's greatness isn't in its historical longevity or its pageantry. It's in how it rectifies its systemic administrative violence.
True restorative justice requires dismantling the bureaucratic conveyor belts that cause the harm, not just hosting state dinners with beehive honey.
And it forces us to reevaluate the actual utility of state apologies. We see a clear life cycle here.
Decades of state denial, relentless grassroots advocacy by the survivors, eventually a beautifully worded formal apology, and then
A massive deficit in actual material redress.
which leads to a profound, somewhat provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up today's deep dive.
Building on that life cycle of apologies.
Exactly. We know that a modern monarch like Charles is constitutionally barred from enacting political policy or cutting a check for financial reparations. He can only offer the soft power of his sympathy.
Right.
But does the very existence of a purely symbolic head of state actually serve a darker purpose? Does deploying the monarch to absorb public outrage actively neutralize the demand for systemic change?
It's a heavy question.
In other words, does all this immaculate diplomatic pageantry, the historical artifacts, the standing ovations, the eloquent regret, does it actually prevent true legislative redress by making the public feel like an issue has been resolved simply because an apology was beautifully delivered?
Do we applaud the performance on stage and deliberately ignore the fire burning backstage?
Thank you so much for sharing this incredible stack of sources for today's deep dive. It completely rewrites how we view the mechanics of statecraft. Keep looking beneath the surface, and we'll catch you on the next one.